Welcome, everyone. Call tonight's regular council meeting to order. Recommendation that the agenda for the regular council meeting of October 7th, 2019 be adopted as presented with the addition of agenda item 4A, Joy Thorkelson from the United Fishermen and Allied Workers Union. Moved by Councilor Randhawa, seconded by Councilor Adie. All is in favor? Any opposed? Motion is carried. Item 3A, recommendation the minutes of the special council meeting of September 3rd, 2019 be adopted. Moved by Councilor Adie, seconded by Councilor Randhawa. All those in favor? Any opposed? Motion is carried. Item 3B, recommendation of the minutes of the special regular council meeting of September 3rd, 2019 be adopted. Moved by Councilor Niche, seconded by Councilor Adie. All those in favor? Any opposed? Motion is carried. Item 3C, recommendation of the minutes of the regular council meeting of September 9th, 2019 be adopted. Moved by Councilor Adie, seconded by Councilor Randhawa. All those in favor? Any opposed? Motion is carried. Okay, first we'd like to call up a petition delegation, Joy Thorkelson from the United Fishermen and Allied Workers Union, regarding support for emergency federal climate change disaster assistance funding. Welcome. Welcome back.
This is Conrad Lewis. He's our South Coast organizer, and he's been dealing with fishermen on the South Coast for the past number of years, although he's from Kitkatla. So I kind of joked and said Kitkatla is spreading the north is spreading its influence south. I want to thank council for getting a letter to the fisheries minister, for passing a letter and getting it off for the fisheries minister. This year started off to be the expectations that DFO published for this year were actually quite good. So we started off thinking we're going to get a fishery on the Skeena that would be between 200 and 400,000 pieces of sockeye, that the Nass would be pretty good. The Central Coast would be not bad for chum salmon. That coho were fairly strong on the North Coast, and the species that everybody was concerned about was spring salmon. So they felt that there was going to be very little spring salmon coming back to the Nass, the Skeena, but also to every other place on the coast, including California. So what happened is that DFO was like 150% wrong, or 500% wrong, however you want to do it. This was the worst record on ever in British Columbia, not just on the North Coast, everywhere. There was nothing came back except, lo and behold, the spring salmon. The spring salmon actually did not too badly. I mean, I don't want anybody to think they came back in huge numbers, but they actually did return in harvestable numbers. And didn't help the North Coast trollers. They didn't get to fish because of the fishing plan until August 20th, when they usually will start fishing around between June 20th and July 15th, and so they're delayed a month to a month and a half. During that period, they went and did some coho, trolling for coho, but then the Americans closed down their coho fishery, so Canada closed down our coho fishery. It's according to the treaty. So we closed ours down for 10 days, so that left the trollers out of the water for 10 days, when actually on the Canadian side of the border, there didn't seem to be any shortage of coho. So that was a loss to our troll fleet. The gillnet fleet started off, it looked pretty good on the Nass for the first two openings, and then the catches just dropped off. We got closed for the Quinnige's closure, and things just started dropping off from there. The seines came up, and a very small number of them, and they had a couple of dips for pink salmon, to see if there's any pink salmon around, and also for American chum salmon, and there was next to nothing. And so most of those vessels have run all the way up from the South Coast, from Vancouver, Nanaimo, Alert Bay, and those vessels ended up spending more getting here than they did in the amount of fish that they caught. The gill netters, many of them ran down to the Central Coast, because the Central Coast has been looked like it was going to be a decent year down there. Like I say, spring salmon, which is an early spring salmon fishery, opens on usually the 1st of June. It did quite well, so everybody was expecting the chum fishery to do well, and the chum fishery just tanked. There's a couple of openings for gill netters, but as soon as the fleet got too large, they shut it down in the middle of August, and there wasn't a fishery there, and there still isn't a fishery there. They say there's not enough stocks for late chum catches. So now you've got the North Coast closed, you've got the Central Coast closed. So what was going to go on Vancouver Island? Well, what went on for the Fraser River was the smallest return, they're saying, in over 100 years. So they didn't see they think that a smaller return may have occurred in the 1890s. So that's well over 100 years. And that was without the disaster of the Fraser Slide, which just compounded things for the future. It didn't compound things for this year, but compounded things for the future. The small bright spot was the number of Chinook that returned to Vancouver Island, and they had some terminal gillnet fisheries on Vancouver Island for a handful of gillnet fishermen. But it looks like I got a call today. It looks like the chum season is basically closed on the South Coast. It's closed for two reasons: one, because the chum didn't return, and two, because there's a problem with Thompson, Chilcotin, Steelhead, which co-migrate with the Johnson Straits, which is Fraser River chum salmon, and so they were going to have a rolling 90-day closure, which turned out to be shut down. So if you're a South Coast only, which there's only a handful of those, a South Coast only seiner, you made no money this year. There was no openings for you. If you were a South Coast, North Coast seiner, it was almost worse because you went in the hole, because you put fuel in your tank to come up here, you fixed your boat up, you fixed your nets up, you got up here, and then your expenses exceeded the amount of fish that you got. And if you're a gill netter, and the gill netters were in the same boat, they spent money coming up from the South Coast, the guys on the South Coast who did come up here. The people who resided here might be a bit better off because they didn't have those initial fuel expenses, but still everybody had to get ready for the season, and since everybody thought this was going to be a good season, everybody spent money pre-season, right? So you spend money pre-season because you think that it's going to be a decent season. So everybody is in the hole. Everybody is desperate. Because it is a coast-wide issue, it's definitely an ocean problem. It's not a freshwater problem. It's not just a freshwater problem. It could have exacerbated it, whatever was going on 4 years ago, depending on which species you're looking at, 4 years ago, 3 years ago, 2 years ago. But whatever it is, it's not just freshwater, because those things are spotty, right? Something happens in this area or something happens in this area, but it's not generally a coast-wide thing. Fish farms, lots of people think it's fish farms, and I have absolutely no doubt. I think the record is very clear that disease contamination from fish farms does hurt migrating stocks, but the North Coast and Central Coast stocks don't pass through those fish farms. So, and we were just as impacted as everywhere else. Southern Alaska was impacted. The Columbia River was impacted. So so the conclusion is that it was ocean conditions, and that leads us to climate change, and that's why we've asked for climate change disaster assistance from the government. Now on the East Coast, the government has basically extends EI. The minister is very clear that's not EI, and it's not an EI extension, but it quacks like a duck and it looks like a duck. What happens is that you get what you got on unemployment insurance for another 6 weeks. And that is called ICE Emergency Disaster Assistance Program. And it's if there is ice over the fishing grounds, then you can get your EI extended for 6 weeks, although they don't call it EI. It comes from the Minister of Fisheries, and he says it's a grant, but it's adjudicated by the ministry in charge of employment insurance. So for all intents and purposes, it's employment insurance. So we were asking for something like that because there's two problems. One is people don't have incomes, so they're not going to get EI this year. And so they don't have incomes, they're not going to get EI. And then they have the guys who own boats, so the gillnetters, trollers, and the seine vessel owners. Those guys have to also pay for the looking after of those vessels over the winter time. So they've got to get them out of the water. They've got to get them keep them in shape to get them inspected so they can go back fishing. They need some money to make sure they're insured. Although I bet you most of the gillnets on the North Coast aren't insured. They should have insurance, and they need to have their moorage looked after. Now, it would be easy enough for the Minister of Fisheries because moorage comes under Small Crafts Harbours Board, which comes under the DFO's Minister of Fisheries portfolio. And it would be easy enough for the Minister of Fisheries to provide a subsidy to the Small Craft Harbours Boards involved to pay for gillnet and seine and troll vessels so that they can tie up over the winter in a safe place with power so that their boats are looked after during the winter time, so we don't have a bunch of boats that sink or are unable to go out. Then they need to be maintained, need to be lifted out and scraped in the fall or in the spring. Otherwise, they're just unfishable. You can't really go fishing if you got a bunch of seaweed hanging on the bottom of your boat. So there's those expenses as well, and we thought EI would be a relatively easy thing for the government to do, is just to give us emergency EI like they've done to lots of other places in the past, and to lots of other definable groups in the past. And this is a very definable group. You can define everybody who bought, everybody who went out with a personal fishing license on salmon, so that would include your seinboat deckhands, and everybody who has a license that owns a vessel. So if you have a vessel, so Canadian Fish, as much as I like to battle with them, Canadian Fish, and there's other companies also that own vessels. And those vessels, if they aren't kept in ship shape, people die, right? So you can't, Canadian Fish needs to have some help. The same thing, they probably don't need moorage because they probably have enough moorage for their vessels, but what they do need for sure is some help in maintenance over the winter time and to get those boats ready. Now, so it's been a disaster, and we have really had no help from the politicians. You figure that they'd be climate change is the biggest issue. Figure that everybody would be falling over themselves to look at two things. One, providing disaster assistance, and the second thing is to meet with fishermen to talk about climate adaptation in the future. What needs to change so we never have this happen again? There's nothing we can do with the ocean other than as a country and as a world to stop climate change. But what we need to do for fishermen is have a look at licensing, have a look at vessels, have a look at maintenance, have a look at a whole series of things, have a look at a crop insurance program. I mean, there's insurance. There was. I haven't looked it up, but last time I talked about this in 2015, I think, there was crop insurance for hay in Manitoba that got eaten by moose. You could buy insurance, but you can't do it for fishing. There is no crop insurance style stuff for fishing. Apparently they tried it for 1 or 2 years in the East Coast. It didn't work, and so they just dropped it. And but those are the kinds of things. We need a basket of things that the Minister of Fisheries needs to sit down with fishermen, because this year it was salmon. Next year, maybe because climate change goes up and down, maybe it's going to be okay for salmon, but it's going to be disastrous for crabs. The biggest year for crabs this last year is the only thing that gave anybody work in the fish plants this year were crabs. Crabs came back in huge numbers, like larger than they have in the past, 12 or 15 years. So that's what really saved our waterfronts bacon. Otherwise, we would have just seen nothing, nobody working. So Canadian Fish said that of their senior workers, probably 20 or 30 of them got enough for EI, and so everybody else who worked, another 30 or 40 people, and these are senior people. Like, these aren't, there's nobody who's junior that works at that fish plant anymore. So these are people who've all worked in the fishing industry for 20 or 30 years, and half of them aren't going to get EI. And we have fishermen. It's just a disaster. And if we want to hold on to the vessels, and we want to hold on to some semblance of owner-operator and some semblance of trained deckhands, then we have to do something about the commercial fishing industry. And that's why it's so, and it is, and I last thing I'm going to say is that there's $400 million in landed value. $200 million, over $200 million that's landed on, that comes out of North Coast, Central Coast waters. $200 million landed value. $400 to $500 million on wholesale value, and we don't if we don't make sure there's an owner operator fleet out there that is able to catch that, we're going to end up with what's gone on in other industries, which bigger and bigger vessels move in, and foreign vessels start fishing your fish, right? So now we're sending our fish off to China, or not just China, but to low-wage countries for processing and re-importing it. If anybody doubts me, just go down, look in the frozen section of Overweighty and Safeway. You'll find Sobeys brand and Western Family brand. Looks like it's a Canadian product until you read the fine print. It's packaged in China. And if we don't look after our fleet, we're going to have people who are going to be catching our fish from foreign countries as well. If we don't have a fleet to catch that fish, somebody else will catch it for us. So it is a huge issue. It's a Canadian issue. It's an issue driven by climate change. We need to have this licensing discussions. We need to have EI discussions. We need to have, how do you maintain the boats, and you need to talk about how do we maintain fishermen, how do we get fishermen to stay in the industry? How do you get new fishermen to come into the industry if it's such a disaster? We have to fix this. And part of the fixing is making sure that the people who exist now are able to make it through to the next summer. Then we have to talk about, how do we fix this for the future? So thank you very much. And thank you for writing. And it's an important issue, because that money could come into our community. And we can't just be a community. I mean, as much as I think the container port has been the savior of this community. If somebody in the United States decides to stop importing trinkets or importing stuff from China, I'm going to say trinkets, that's pretty bad. But we're going to stop importing Chinese steel. We're going to stop importing other things because the Americans aren't going to bring it in, or whatever reason. We need to have a fallback, and the fishing industry provides food for the world. It should provide food for us, but it provides food for us and food for the world. And for food security, we need to have Canadians catching that fish and Canadians controlling the resource. And we need to protect our fishermen and our shore workers and our processing infrastructure. Because if we don't protect that, we have nothing to promote fishing, and it will just be something that will just say, well, we used to. Well, yeah, I remember we used to can our own salmon. Oh, we don't do that anymore. Oh, we used to freeze our own salmon. We used to freeze our own. Well, we don't even catch that anymore commercial. I mean, that's just ridiculous. That's fish sitting offshore. Those are jobs offshore, and they belong. First Nations would say they belong firstly to them, and they belong to Canada. And I think that that whether, no matter who works in Canada on that fish, it needs to be people who are adjacent to the resource.
Thank you for that, Joy. Is there any questions from council?
Thanks for sharing all of that. I know when we first talked about it a couple of months ago now, I think, you were in the process of writing letters and approaching different levels of government. So I actually have three questions. But the first question is, what's happened? How would you describe any progress or lack of that might have been made in addressing, particularly the federal government, since that's the primary address for the letter?
My words fail me in the lack of a response that we've had from the federal government. So the union wrote our first letter, believe it or not, August 1st, because we could see the writing on the wall. I have been around long enough to be able to, my crystal ball by August 1st is not cloudy anymore. And so we wrote our first letter on August 1st. Commercial Salmon Advisory Board wrote one on the 15th. And Shane Simpson from, on August 20th, wrote one to Minister, Shane Simpson is the Minister of Social Development and Poverty Reduction for BC. And he's provincial minister, and he wrote to Patricia Hadju, who's the minister in charge of EI, on August 20th. On August 30th, Area E Harvest Committee and Area D Harvest Committee wrote a letter. And on September 3rd, Lana Popham sent us letters saying that she had been talking to Minister Wilkinson. And finally, on September 4th, we got a letter from Minister Wilkinson, and Minister Wilkinson told us to go to talk to Minister Hadju from EI. He says that, unfortunately, your request for compensation, well, we didn't ask for compensation, we asked for disaster relief, but anyway, unfortunately, your request for compensation goes beyond DFO's mandate. However, I see you have shared your letter with my colleague, the Honourable Patricia A. Hadju, Minister of Employment, Workforce Development and Labour Canada. I trust that she will give your request due consideration. So, and then he says, DFO does have programs to provide some opportunity for harvesters to exit the industry. So you can sell your license to the ATP program, to Allocation Transfer Program, or for PICFI, both of which are, so you can sell your license to the federal government and they'll buy it up and they'll transfer your license to a First Nation. So they'll transfer a license that can't catch anything to a First Nation for what purpose, right? So, but they will buy you out to do that. So that was our answer from the minister. So that was September 4th. And then we sent a letter to Mr. Hadju on September 16th, and we have yet to get a letter back from her. But we did get a letter back from Catherine McKenna on October 4th, and she says that she's not in charge of she's in charge of climate change. Her portfolio is Minister of Environment and Climate Change, and we asked to meet with her and to discuss our problems. And Minister McKenna is unable to accept your kind invitation since the matter you raised is responsibility of fisheries and oceans. I've noted that you've sent your correspondence to Minister Wilkinson. And then the only one, and we have 225 form letters that have gone, and every fisherman has filled them out with how much he's made this year, right? So 225 letters with how much they've made has been ticked off in a box and what areas they fish in, have gone to 11 ministers, provincial and federal ministers, 11 provincial and federal ministers, 225 letters. And I see that Minister Lana Popham has been answering the letters that she was copied on, which is 225 of them. So that's a lot of.
There were 70 more sent last week.
Yeah, 70 more sent last week, and Christina sent 70. So yeah, or 150 Christina sent. So anyway, we so that's the answer. We've been kicked around like a political football. The provincial government is saying it's a federal government issue. The federal government is saying. And last Friday, the director for Area B, executive director for Area B, Chris Ashton, we found out at 11 o'clock at night that there was going to be a press conference that Minister Wilkinson was holding to announce some salmon, money for salmon. And so Krista Ashton went on behalf of fishermen to ask, well, what about fishermen? What about some emergency money for fishermen? And he says it's not his ministry, it's Hadju's ministry, the Ministry of EI. So there you go. So that's a long and sad story. And I know, that council, I thank you very much. I know I really only have 5 minutes, but you've been very, very glad to hear me. But when I was here, I was never short-winded. So.
Yeah,
And I'll try to be brief.
Well, I think it's an important subject. So
I think it's fine.
I don't
Perfect
begrudge
time,
the time at all. My second question was, I'm listening to your saga of it's a bit like waiting for an actual human being to answer at some telephone company, and you can never get to anybody, right? It must be tremendously frustrating, and the year is wearing on, and the problem is continuing, right? So what I hear is there's this rather discouraging effort to deal with something in the short term. And I'm wondering if there's any more optimism about some of the other stuff you were describing around long-term solutions that aren't just shrinking the fleet. I read a couple of days ago that the BC salmon industry is no longer getting the eco certification. I don't know if you know about that, but because it's unable to meet the conditions of sustainability, which tells us how much trouble we're in terms of the salmon stock.
Well, I phoned the department. I haven't researched this as much as I could, but what I did is I phoned the Department of Fisheries because I was wondering why they aren't doing what they had promised to do. See, this process is driven by Unilever. Okay, so a great big chemical company, Unilever. This is their certification process. So they have this certification process. It's almost like a blackmail process because if you don't have an eco certification, it's more difficult to sell your fish. And so what they do is they have they have a number of standards that they apply to fish, and it's whether it's pollock or tuna or to salmon, and they're very difficult to meet. And when Alaska was the first one who got eco certified, they got eco certified just after the I don't remember the coho crisis, which was in 1998 to 2001, and they got certified during that period of time, and they were the biggest takers of coho. We were taking 0, but 0 meant 2%. So we were taking in Canada 2% of coho, and the Americans were taking like 30%. They were taking the whole harvest, and we said, you're driving our fisheries down so that we can't fish. And the certification people came to see me, and I said that to them directly, and they said, well, that's not our issue. Our issue is with the people in the country who are catching the fish. So it didn't matter that the Americans were catching our fish and driving them down in those days. And that we weren't fishing because the Americans were catching too much fish. So the process. But once they got their certification, we had to get our certification. So it was like this thing. Once one person does it, then somebody else has to buy it. It's very, very expensive, and it's not the government of Canada who is a client. It's consortium. Every different fishery is different, but in salmon, it's a consortium of the processing companies that are considered to be the client, and so the processing company is too. My understanding is it's too expensive for them to meet because they have to pay for it. It's not the government of Canada. They have to pay for the people that come in and look at whether you're meeting the process or not. So they are saying that they don't think that we would pass. I phoned DFO. DFO says that they think that they would pass, that they think that they have been meeting the standards. But they say, if you look at it, the price per pound of fish caught this year, it just puts it completely out off, they can't certify this year because it's, maybe it costs them $2 per pound of fish caught this year because there's hardly any fish caught, right? And so the companies have to amortize that over the pounds of fish caught. So now I haven't spoken to the consortium of companies who have done that, but DFO has assured me that they have actually believe that they have done the science that needed to be done. And so it wasn't a lack of science, it was a lack of money in the industry in order to go through that process.
Last one, and I want to bring it home a little bit. Obviously, the jurisdictional issues are either federal or provincial, or they can sort that out between themselves, I guess. But we're a local government, and we're talking about local people. So, do you see a role for local government to play in any way in terms of support? Obviously, it's a more limited playing field, but I'm interested in what you see if there's anything there.
Well, I think that putting pressure on both federal and provincial governments, I don't hold that this is just a federal government problem, even though the provincial government likes to say that. We live in the province of British Columbia. We don't live in the province of Saskatchewan or province of Manitoba. We live in the province of British Columbia. So therefore, the provincial government has some responsibility. If everybody has to go on welfare, who pays for that, right? If mental health problems go up because people are losing their livelihoods, who pays for that, right? It's the provincial government has to look after those things. So municipally, I think that, locally there's a Port Ed Harbor Authority. Somebody should be speaking to the Port Ed Harbor Authority, and speaking and which is basically run by Port Edward, and Port Edward I think appoints
It's a joint board.
Yeah, appoints the most
Right,
number
yeah.
of people to it,
Yeah.
and talking to them and seeing if there's a way that they can go as a harbors board to the federal government or to the provincial government and say, look, we need some help, financial help, to make sure that if you were a salmon fisherman, you can keep your boat here. So
Joy?
I think we could do that.
Maybe to also try to interject there, would it be helpful if we accompanied you, or one of us accompanied you with the minister in those meetings? Like if you get a federal minister meeting,
It
would you feel that would be something to show that the community is on the ground there?
Absolutely. If we could
That's
get
something I think we could help you with for sure there.
That would be great if we
Okay.
could get somebody from communities there to show both either the federal or the provincial government that communities actually care, which I believe that every community that has fishermen care, and that would be great. The trouble is trying to get a meeting. As you can see, we're just a political football, and we thought it would be much. I mean, the government was dishing up. We started this the 1st of August. The government was running through the whole of Canada, dishing out money to everybody. I mean, I think the city of Rupert was got some of that.
Mhm.
That let's throw money here and there, but they couldn't find. I mean, this is not very many fishermen. We're not talking like hundreds of thousands of people. We're talking about a very small group of fishermen. Like there's on seine boats, there might be 80 seine boats left on the coast that are actually fishable, right? 80 guys who go fishing, 80 boats full of people that go fishing. This year, the ones that actually fished were probably somewhere around 40 boats. And the gillnet fleet, the North Coast gillnet fleet, I think it peaked at maybe 230, and half of those people were double licensed, and so they would be the ones that would be fishing in Area D, so they got a little bit of fish there. The other people just got expenses, and but even so, you're maybe looking at 400 gillnet fishermen, and you're maybe looking at trollers, maybe 300 trollers. I mean, you're not looking at hundreds and like thousands and thousands of people. You're probably looking at, and then shore workers. There'll be senior shore workers in every plant that didn't work this year, unless you were lucky enough to have a company that bought crabs or offloaded crabs. So it's not like, and they're definable people. It's not like you're just opening it up to anybody, right? It's easily definable. So yes, Mayor Brain, that would be exactly, that would be very helpful if we can get a meeting.
I think we can help get a meeting too. So let's
It's
maybe work
getting a
together on that.
meeting that's the issue.
We'll get on that then after tonight.
And to state the obvious, the timing at the moment this month with a federal election means that some of the faces in the chairs may not be the same afterwards. I'm not sure.
We'll wait till obviously the
You're gonna
elections.
have to wait,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah, and this is right now, if there's any fishermen listening, right now we're asking, because this is the week that fishermen would apply for unemployment insurance on a regular basis. They don't get to apply till the first week of October. And so fishermen need to apply so they can get rejected, right? So we can build the stats
Okay.
to show what,
Right. Gotcha.
you know, that they're unable to make it. So fishermen need to apply. And we've been getting phone calls, and yes, even if they don't have, they need to apply. Same with shore workers. If you don't, if you apply, and yeah, then the number exactly.
Okay. Councilor Randall. Oh, sorry, Nick. Did you have, or Councilor Ady, did you have any more?
Thanks for your presentation. Just want to make sure like we are looking for assistance for fishermen and also shore workers too, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
and tendermen, and there's like
Anybody affected by
That's
this
right.
climate thing, right?
our 4 tendermen on Fred's boat. I want to tell you, yes, 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 you're included. I always forget to say tendermen, but you guys are included.
Any other comments? Thank you very much for your time. We'll be in touch after this, and we'll figure out a strategy together. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry it took up so much of your
That's
time.
okay. It's nice to see you again.
Thanks.
Okay, next up, we have a report from our city planner regarding an application for development variance permit 2040 at Can Road, Four Seasons Maintenance. Welcome back.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. This application is for a property located at 240 Kane Road. It's outlined in red. It is to vary the accessory building height from 3.6 meters to 6 meters. This is an approximate illustration of the proposed shed. It's going to be located on this drawing. Actually, I'm going to go back to the, this was supplied by the applicant. I'll go back to the context drawing. It'll be located between Legate Road and the building somewhere in this area in here. This is an industrial area where multiple accessory buildings are permitted. Considering the current industrial zoning and nature of business, it is reasonable to make an exception for the structure. The proposed structure will have a minimum impact, if any, on the neighborhood properties. Subject to receiving development variance permit application for industrial zone development permit, which will be required the applicant to paint the containers uniform color. And in conclusion, Mr. Mayor, the applicant requires approval to proceed to public notification.
Okay, so recommendation that development variance permit application DP 1909 for the property located at 2040 Can Road proceed to public notification. Moved by Councillor Niche, seconded by Councillor Ady. Any discussion? Okay, all those in favor? Any opposed? Motion's carried. Next, we have an application for development variance permit at 1144 7th Avenue East.
So the subject property, as you just mentioned, Mr. Mayor, is located at 114 7th Avenue East, outlined in a red border on the overhead projector. Of course, the full application is attached in attachment number 1. Uh, this development variance permit, we included a picture to show the age of the building. This development variance is for the side yard. The existing building already has an existing non-conforming encroachment to 0.08 meters, and in order to complete the addition will require a development variance permit for the same side yard setback. This is an older neighborhood where many houses have existing non-conforming yard setbacks. The proposed renovation will not adversely affect the neighborhood. And in conclusion, Mr. Mayor, the applicant requires approval to proceed to public notification.
Thank you. So recommendation that the development variance permit application DP 1910 for 1144 7th Avenue East proceeds to public notification. Moved by Councillor Randhawa, second by Councillor Ady. Discussion? All those in favor? Any opposed? Motion's carried. Thank you very much. Next, we have a report from our Chief Financial Officer regarding the August 2019 financial variance report.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The operating and utility revenues and expenses continue to be on track with the overall budget, with the same caveats mentioned in previous reports this year. There are no significant variances to report at this time for the end of August, for operations up through the end of August. Capital projects were continuing as at the end of August, and costs will continue to be recorded as work progresses. And that concludes my report.
Thank you. Questions from council? Okay, next we have a report from our communications manager regarding approval of a communications policy for the city of Prince Rupert.
Sure. So you guys have seen the draft of this communications policy previously. We had a workshop and discussed some changes. There were some slight amendments based on discussion with council, and now I'm presenting it again for your consideration.
Thank you. Any comments from councilors? I have to say it's a very thorough and updated and modern communications policy, and we appreciate all the work that's been done on it. So the recommendation is that council repeal the previous 2003 communications policy number 110-3 and approve by resolution the attached communications policy. Moved by Councillor Ady, seconded by Councillor Niche. Discussion?
And just a question. If you were to compare the old policy and this policy, what would you say are the highlight improvements in it?
Well, for one, the previous policy was from 2003, so it didn't really reference the kinds of internet communications that we now use pretty frequently. And we also didn't have communications staff on hand, so there are a lot more kind of commitments on the city's part to communicate with the community, and the policy outlines those.
Other questions? Okay, all those in favor? Any opposed? Motion's carried. Thank you. Next we have the permissive property tax exemption bylaw number 3447 2019. Any final recommendations?
Just a comment. So since the permissive tax exemption bylaw was introduced in September, staff have undertaken the notification in the paper, and we received a total of 1 inquiry. There were no objections received. So for a permissive tax exemption bylaw to take effect, it must be, for 2020, it must be adopted by October 31st. Thank you.
Great. So the recommendation is that council adopt the permissive property tax exemption bylaw number 3447 2019. Moved by Councillor Randhawa, second by Councillor Ady. Discussion? Okay, all those in favor? Any opposed? Motion's carried. Next, at our last council meeting, Councillor Randhawa put a notice of motion forward for a letter to be prepared to CN regarding the Via Rail schedule. Did you want to comment on that letter?
Yeah, sure. Like our tourism industry is a big boost for our community, but lots of people using Via Rail for in and out to go like catch ferries and come back. So that, but it's again like last Saturday, train came around 4:30 in the morning, supposed to be here 8 in the evening. So it's not fair for the tourists, like they're sitting like 18-20 hours. So just asking for CN or minister to look into so they can get VRL passengers can get schedule their
Some more, yeah,
yes,
better scheduling.
better schedule, like a schedule there. So that's what I'm looking for, like write down a letter to CN and also to the minister
Sure.
to give schedule for schedule.
Okay, so the recommendation is that a letter be prepared and sent from Council CN regarding the Via Rail schedule, and I'll say additionally to the ministry is in charge of rail transportation. Moved by Councillor Renhouse, seconded by Councillor Ady. Any discussion?
I just hope that this letter doesn't go in circles like some of the other letters we've talked about tonight.
Good point. Okay, any further discussion? Okay, oh, you got a question? Yeah.
I just think it needs to be stated in the letter too, more about the fact that Greyhound has pulled out of the Western Canada and how that's affected the train traffic too, and how more people are or would probably use the train, being that we don't have the buses anymore either. So that could be stated in the letter also.
Sure, we'll make a note of that. Anything else? Okay, all those in favor? Any opposed? Motion's carried. Questions, reports, or inquiries from members of council? Councillor Ady.
A little while ago, we talked about lead in pipes for the water and the idea that for the most part, I think there was a notification or information that came out saying that if your house was built prior to 1990, there's a possibility that some of the soldering in the copper pipes in the residential property might have lead in them. So given that that's most of the houses in town in terms of age, I'm just wondering how a homeowner could go about getting their water tested so that they could either respond or put their minds at ease. I don't know who to ask that question of. But,
So we did do a free water sampling program with Northern Health as part of testing to see if that was an issue. But unfortunately, that program is now over. So now if people would like to get water testing for their home, they can go to the local lab here. We're lucky enough to have a water testing lab in our community, so NorLabs, and I think it's between $30 and $40 for a home test kit.
And just on that note too, we have an information video on the city's website and Facebook page that outlines what the water issues are. And now that we have received funding for all 3 phases of the water supply project, that once the water treatment facility is constructed, that many of the issues in the community should be resolved from that point forward. But in the meantime, that we've been expressing caution that folks who may or may not know if they have lead in their pipes at their homes, that they should be flushing and checking their water, but also that the city is not delivering lead to people's homes. So that's one message we really want to make sure that people realize, is that the city's water supply itself is not carrying lead to the home. It's the potential leaching of the lead from lead pipes in a home that is the issue ultimately here. So once the balance of pH happens through the water treatment, that issue should be resolved hopefully. So we're working as fast and as hard as possible to get the water fully updated from the 100 years it's been sitting there like how it is, and we look forward to having one of the best water treatment systems in Canada. More reports?
I didn't want to mislead about that. I understood that it was about the pipes in people's homes. I just also, my other thing is I'd like to reflect a little bit upon the UBCM conference that we all went to. It was my first time to go, and it was, without question, the biggest, sort of convention event I've ever been to, and I appreciated the amount of coordination and organization that goes into these things. And I felt that the 3 pieces of it that were the most significant were the learning forums. I know I attended one on money laundering in BC that Minister Eby and Minister James both spoke at. And it was really interesting to learn what the mechanics of money laundering have been, and to find out what provincial government has done, and with some results, but also the notion that if you shut off one tap or one place that money can get laundered, the money's still out there, and they're very good at finding other ways to do it. So I think the more recent example in the Lower Mainland was luxury car dealerships or luxury car industry. So it's definitely a work in progress. But I thought those learning forums were really useful. Obviously, the chances we had to meet with ministers was very valuable, and we had a number of those meetings. And finally, the most public part of it, which is the resolutions. For example, a couple of months ago, we had somebody come and talk about lobbying to get the vote extended to permanent residents. It was called the Lost Votes campaign, and that resolution passed. So the resolution was to ask the provincial government to make that change. So it really sort of illustrates how there's a real grassroots quality to the UBCM and to how it can reach other levels of government. So I thought it was really an interesting experience.
Great, thank you for that. Other reports from council? Okay, on that note, then I'd entertain a motion to adjourn. Moved by Councillor Ady, second by Councillor Renhawa. All those in favor? Meeting is adjourned. Thank you.